And so I'm going to introduce our next speaker, who is Melissa Caldwell. She has come up from UC Santa Cruz for us. And she has, she's going to be talking about well, what's your title?
Food for the Nation.
Food for the Nation, Understanding Russia's Post-Soviet Transition. But she knows a whole lot of much more general things in food too, so you may be able to expand her in your Q&A session. And partly it's because she's the editor of Gastronomica, I say that right? Gastronomica, which is the Journal of Critical Food Studies down there. But she conducts ethnographic fieldwork in Russia and has been doing that for a long time. So she's going to bring us into that area of the world for an extended look at the topic.
Okay.
And you may add whatever else you wish to do.
Great. Thank you. Thank you all. So I'm happy to talk about food in Russia. I'm happy to talk about food, and I'm happy to talk about Russia. So whatever you would like. And I tend to talk off script, so I apologize if I kind of wander and give you kind of the deep history of the Soviet Union and post-Soviet life. But feel free to interrupt if you have questions too. I just want to start with this slide because I took this when I started doing my fieldwork in Russia in the mid-1990s. This is the Central Telegraph and Telephone Office in downtown Moscow. It's about 2 blocks from Red Square and the Kremlin. And this was where, back during the Soviet days, if you wanted to make a phone call or send a telegraph, you had to go to this office. You had to stand in line, fill out a form. Then they would assign you a time in a booth, and then you'd come back and you'd sit in the booth and the phone would ring and you would be connected. And so we've got this nice little, this is like the central hub for all of the Soviet Union too, not just Moscow and Russia, but the Soviet Union. And so we've got the nice Soviet globe with hammer and sickle and all the Soviet iconography all around it, and the big advertisement for Coca-Cola. So this was kind of this moment in the early 1990s when things were starting to change pretty dramatically in Russia. And so I kind of want to talk about some of those changes and where they came from and why and what they might tell us and if they're really that new. Actually, maybe a little bit about me. I was interested in Russia long before I became interested in food. And it was kind of a preoccupation from high school. And it was also partly teenage rebellion. I grew up in the South in Tennessee, a very, very conservative, politically, religiously conservative area. And by studying Russia, I was the outsider, right? I was the communist in my high school, whatever that meant, right? Nobody knew what that meant. But it was kind of my form of teenage rebellion. I just got hooked and have become just absolutely fascinated. And I find that Russia is one of those places that the deeper you get in, the more there is to learn, the more there is to know. It's still a very misunderstood part of the world, I think, in many ways. And so it's just something that's kept me going for 25 years now, I think. So a really long time. And then when I was in graduate school, I took a history class, and history of Russia class. And for random reasons that I don't know at this point, I did a paper on banqueting and realized that there's a story about food in Russia that goes back centuries. And it's really interesting to look at food as ways to think about social organization in Russia, emerging class distinctions in Russia, relations between the monarchy and the peasants, looking at different ethnicities as they move across the Russian Empire. And that just kind of got me hooked into looking at food more generally. So that's kind of how my two interests have come together. So much of my research since the 90s has really looked at the question of the political dimensions of food in Russia and how food helps us understand political life, political activity, whether it's about national identity, whether it's about citizenship or forms of civic life, civic participation in Russia. And so just some questions that come up in food studies. Often, why is food important to nations? There's often a lot of research that's done on food and national identity or food and ethnic identity or national cuisines or regional cuisines. But there's some really important questions about, okay, so we have this idea that food and nation or food and region or food and ethnicity or whatever those things are go together, but what does that mean, right? Like, could we even ask a question like, what does a nation taste like? Do nations have tastes? Often there's a perception that comes out in food research where people from particular national communities are very committed to particular foods that reflect their national identity. So I think it's a viable question to ask, what does a nation taste like? And there was something that came out in my research over and over and over again when I was interviewing people. This is an exemplary quote here, but Russian taste buds prefer Russian flavors. And there was a sense that Russian bodies actually recognize Russian foods. That there's something about the correlation between the physiology of the person who is Russian, the flavor and other essences of foods, and the soil from which those foods are grown. And that people instinctively recognize foods that are of their nation, and that those foods are healthier for them. And in a recent research paper, I actually kind of looked at this historically, and we see this coming up in the 16th century already, where health reformers in Russia are telling Russians what to eat based on what's growing in the ground. And it's all about cultivating flora in the gut, even though they're not using those terms, but there's this sense that, okay, a Russian stomach is going to be able to eat cabbage. You're not going to be able to eat French food because it's too refined, or you can't eat German food because it's too coarse. You need to eat this, 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 and this. And so this continues to play out today. And so then this kind of opens up other questions about, the qualities of food, and questions around the sensory experiences around food. So taste, smell, texture, all of these questions kind of get loaded onto these questions about national identity. And then I'm going to suggest maybe more than that, they can be mobilized for state-making projects, and that much of how the Russian state has built itself, both in not just in the imperial period, but in the Soviet period and now in the post-Soviet period, really is tied up with playing with the qualities of food. Okay, so why would it be important to look at a socialist or post-socialist society like Russia? One of the things that's been interesting in food studies is that kind of in the 1990s, when there was this big growth of scholarship being done in food studies, much of it was coming out of places like the former Soviet Union and China and Eastern Europe. And there was something about the way in which the political and economic transitions in those places were happening that really brought food to the forefront. And this was a counterpoint to much of the Americanist-based scholarship. Up until that point and continuing today, there's still been at least North American scholarship on food studies has been a preoccupation with capitalist, neoliberal, democratic societies, the US being kind of where much of this food scholarship is coming out of, but also contrast between first world and third world, the West and the East, where the first world, the US, and other Western countries have been privileged as having better forms of health, better forms of food production, better food systems. But these open up certain very specific questions then about what states are, what economies are, how do they work, what are the roles and rights and responsibilities of consumers in those societies. Looking at socialist and post-socialist societies brings in a completely different angle to that, because a socialist economy, which was built on communalism, collectivism, a state-run economy, is going to be doing something very different. Maybe, or maybe not, but at least it raises some of those questions. And so we'll talk about some of these things, particularly questions about individualism, collectivism, responsibilization, surveillance. Surveillance comes in very clearly in post-socialist societies. But again, I think there's something more. And this is a question that is implicit in a lot of food studies work, but doesn't get asked all the time. But it's this question of, is food an intrinsic right? Is it a civic right? Is it a human right? And certainly there's a sense that food is a human right. It's a basic, fundamental part of everyday human life. People need it to survive. The United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights sets it out that that people have a right to a standard of living, including food. The Millennium Development Goals are explicitly focused on alleviating hunger, right? So food again comes in as an essential right of humanness. In terms of refugee politics, refugee policy, food, access to food is also one of the primary explicit goals. And so you can kind of see United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, International Organization for Migration. These are both organizations that guarantee access to food, right? So there's something about food that is recognized as being an intrinsic right. But I think it's not just about kind of qualities of humanness. It's really tied to qualities of civic engagement, belonging to states or not belonging to states, and what citizenship in this realm, if we think about food, what citizenship might look like. And so I'll just give you a couple of quick examples here, the ways in which food practices can become part of state-making projects. We certainly see, victory gardens. The US had them. Britain had them. They've been in existence, over much of Europe, especially during wartime movements, as a way to kind of support the state, eliminate or alleviate pressures on state food supply. Food relief programs as well, whether this is a soup kitchen or a food bank or things like food stamps or assistance for children's school lunches, things like that. These are all part of state projects, right? They happen in the US, they happen throughout the world. But even things like farmers markets, CSAs, so community-supported agriculture, these are also forms of state making, right? It's in the interest of civic organizations, governmental groups to have these alternative forms of food provision, right? They're doing something, they're promoting particular political values that may support the state, it may resist some state philosophies, it may be doing something else, maybe creating an alternative to those. And then we start to see even more radical instantiations of this, groups like Food Not Bombs, or more anarchist groups like guerrilla gardeners who just get together and their projects are to deliberately overthrow existing political systems through forms of food provisioning, food distribution. So all of these things together are really about the ways in which food is a political tool, a political object. It has political symbolism. And so we can think about state borders, and I'm using state here loosely, I should have that in quotation marks. So it's not just kind of formal state bodies, but things that act like states. So it could be a government, it could be a quasi-governmental organization, things that set up rules and rights and responsibilities and have to do with access to resources. So let me just give you a couple of examples of some of the ways in which food is played into these kind of state-making political projects in various places. And then we'll move specifically to Russia and why Russia is so interesting, I think. These were some campaign posters that I took in East Germany in 2006. And so this part of East Germany is a very impoverished region after the Berlin Wall came down and German reunification happened. And so this town has one of the highest rates of unemployment in all of Germany. It also has one of the highest rates of immigration from formerly socialist countries. So Poles and Czechs and Slovaks and Hungarians are coming in here. And so there's a lot of tension in this community about the problems of German democracy post-reunification. And so these posters were for one of the kind of neo-socialist, neo-communist political parties in this town. And what's interesting is that they're playing on socialist era campaign imagery here. And specifically talking about with this new political party, there will be access to jobs and money and food. The one on the left is an orange. It's all about kind of implying healthy children, healthy community, healthy state. The one on the right is a play on a socialist era TV producer, but holding Coke. So there's an irony here too, and I don't think it's actually Coke. I think it's actually the East German version of Coke, which they had, right? So during the when East Germany was a separate country, they did everything that the West did, but they had their own spin on it, right? It's kind of the superior part. They were superior to the West. And so it's East German Coke there. Here's an example from South Korea. One of the things in South Korea, when you go to the border between South Korea and North Korea, there are places where it's possible to go on the South Korean border and look over at North Korea, right? There's Pyongyang, kind of that area where foreigners go, but South Koreans can't go there. So they have these 2 or 3 other places where they go. And they were not what I expected. They were carnival places. There were restaurants, there were cafes, there was an amusement park, there were families having picnics. And there, binoculars, and I know people are up there just looking over the border at North Korea. There's also a Popeyes chicken up there. So you can go and eat your Popeyes chicken and all sorts of other Western cuisines, which is a mark of South Koreanness as well, right? Their access to the West, their participation in the West, explicitly there as kind of a commentary on what the North doesn't have. At the same time, in the same complex, next to Popeye's chicken is a souvenir mart where you can buy chocolates that were made in North Korea. So the message here is really that, okay, now you can look at North Korea and you can taste North Korea, right? North Korean chicken, or North Korean chocolates while you're eating your Popeye's chicken and showing that you're part of the West. And then this one is kind of an example. This is further up in that area, these overlooks, where these are really informal little food stalls where families will go and have a picnic while they're looking over the border, right? It's a spectator sport to eat your lunch and look at North Korea. But there's something here about what it means to be a South Korean citizen. Okay. So to move then to thinking about the role of food in state-making projects in the Soviet Union and in Russia, so during the 20th century, now in the 21st century, why was food so important? What was food doing? It's really stunning, I think, to look at all the ways in which food and food practices were really central to state-making projects, state-citizen relationships during the entire 20th century, now into the 21st century. There were 2 major revolutions in the beginning of the 20th century that led to the creation of the Soviet Union. Revolution of 1905 and then the 1917 revolution, which was the Bolshevik Revolution, which officially led to the overthrow of the monarchy and then the creation of the Soviet Union within a couple of years. Both of these revolutions began with citizen disenchantment about inadequate food supplies. That was kind of a leading theme, that there were shortages of food, other basic consumer goods, but bread in particular. And so there are many first-person accounts coming out from both of these periods, 1905 and 1917, that it was people standing in bread lines who were getting grumpy and started talking to the other people in line and agitating, and that the first riots started happening in these bread lines. So that then when Soviet leaders were creating the new Soviet Union in the 1920s, one of their explicit goals was to reform the food system. And so they had a series of 5-year plans that would bring about new political and economic circumstances in the Soviet Union, and changing the food supply was like one of the #1 priorities. And this meant ensuring there was adequate food supply. It meant overhauling how foods were being grown, how they were being produced, how they were being distributed. It also had to do with giving people new values around food. And I'll give you some slides in a minute, but what this meant was that Soviet planners, in order to create their new Soviet Union, this was going to be the most modern, civilized, technologically, scientifically advanced society in the world. Those were kind of the objectives. To get that, they needed to create socialist citizens who could achieve that. They needed people who valued qualities like communalism, egalitarianism, and modernity. And so they did that through changing the food system in radical ways. In some cases, it meant creating new scientific food regimes. So they trained or brought in dietitians, nutritionists, food scientists, and asked them to come up with the most scientifically advanced diet possible, including creating synthetic foods that would, create the best and strongest, healthiest citizens in the world. In some cases, this meant changing who was providing the food supply. In the 30s and 40s in particular, there was a mass project of collectivization, which was really about bringing the agricultural system under state control. The idea was that this food and agriculture were property that belonged to the entire population, and so the state would administer and manage it. And so that was kind of collectivization. So it was a transformation from private property into collective property. And to do this, Soviet planners, in their infinite wisdom, I don't think that's really true, but decided to professionalize agriculture. So they actually created professional agricultural workers. And what this meant was that they kicked off all the peasants off the land. In many cases, this was quite brutal and violent, and many peasants were killed. They lost their land, but they installed professional farmers to do this work. It's a way to make this more efficient, more modern. Now, one of the problems with this was that Soviet planners typically just assigned people jobs. And so they kind of randomly went around the room and said, okay, you're gonna be a farmer, you're gonna be a farmer, you're gonna be a farmer. Didn't matter if people didn't know anything about farming. They just kind of threw people on these agricultural plots. And so there was a lot of inefficiency with the farming as well, because people didn't know what they were doing. In addition, Soviet planners thought it would be great to guarantee a reliable food supply, and so they set up, with their 5-year plans, they set production and target quotas for agricultural production. But because most of the folks didn't know anything about farming, they didn't understand anything about seasonality or climate change or, bugs and all of these things. So often what farmers were expected to produce didn't match up with the reality of what could be produced. So there was a lot of inefficiency generated by this system, but it was meant to be an efficient modern system. One of the other, I think, really interesting transformations that took place with this effort to create a new modern efficient food system had to do with the promotion of values of egalitarianism and collectivism. Gender egalitarian, gender emancipation was a priority for Soviet authorities. There was an idea that men and women should be equal. This is going to be a classless society as well, and so everybody was going to be equal. So how do you do that in a society that had been fairly stratified by class, by gender? Well, one of the things is to get rid of private kitchens and send people to eat in public canteens, public dining halls. So everybody's eating together, everybody's eating the same food, there are no differences in those public canteens. The other piece of this was getting rid of private kitchens in apartments. So for a while there in the 20s and 30s, apartments were actually built without kitchen facilities. The idea was that women did the bulk of the domestic labor of shopping and food prep and cleanup. And if there were no kitchens, women didn't have to bear that burden. And so again, people would be pushed out in public to do this work. Now, as you can imagine, people weren't too excited about this. There are lots of reports that the quality of the food that was being served in these public canteens was pretty abysmal. People didn't really like having to sit next to strangers. They kind of wanted privacy. But it was this project of creating public space. But one of the things that it did was actually transform workers, the idea of what workers could do and what they were expected to do. Underneath all of these kind of moves was an interest in creating the healthiest, strongest workers, to have the strongest labor force in the world, right? So the Soviet state could guarantee that it was creating healthy workers by managing what they were eating in these places, by making sure women were fully productive just like men. So let me give you kind of a couple of pictures. Here's a picture of a Q 1905, leading up to the 1905 revolution. So this was a bread line there. And here is kind of a 1920s, late 1920s, early 1930s photo of a cottage in the countryside with kind of the communal family meals. Fairly simple, but everybody sitting together. Okay, so food became clearly a political project, but also a moral project for this new Soviet state. So the Soviet state was interested in managing its citizens. It was also interested in managing their consumption practices. Throughout the 20th century, there were recurring shortages of food, many of them produced by famines. But also produced at different moments by irresponsible use of food resources, diversion of sugar for making alcohol, or all sorts of things that were going on. So the Soviet state was very interested in making sure that its workers were being responsible and its consumers were being responsible. And these two things came together with temperance movements at different moments during the Soviet era, kind of in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And although temperance was ostensibly about preserving resources, preserving grains and sugar, it was also about making sure that workers weren't too drunk to do their jobs. Okay, so they had, high rates of alcoholism and, people not doing their jobs. And so there's a whole kind of series of campaigns targeting temperance to do both of these things, consumption and work. And so this is a poster from that period, and what it says is, don't be this person. A day spent gallivanting around town or around the countryside, with your accordion, means that the harvest can be lost, right? You can, just by gallivanting with your accordion, you can actually decimate the entire harvest for the entire country, right? You have to be a responsible citizen. The country depends on you. This is kind of the Soviet version of Uncle Sam, right? And here's another one about the fight against semagon, which is homebrew, moonshine. So there's a lot of moonshine being made behind the scenes, still is. But this one is, you've got the peasant making his moonshine there. And basically it says, a person who makes moonshine is burning up the entire peasant agricultural system, right? He doesn't, does he?
The other guy did.
Okay, so these themes of responsible consumption, responsible work, and responsible citizenship then start to get played out in some different ways in the Soviet Union. If there's going to be this concern about the problems of irresponsible behavior, there have to be rewards for responsible behavior, right? So the Soviet Union did both. They set up punishments for irresponsible people, and people who were considered irresponsible for being alcoholics or being these, moonshiners, or just generally being too drunk to do their jobs were called parasites. That was a technical term for them, parasites. The idea was that they were sucking off the rest of society. So then there were rewards. Food became transformed into a system of rewards and entitlements to encourage people to do their work and to kind of show them what they could achieve if they were good citizens in this new country. So one of the first things that Soviet authorities did was create a system whereby gardens or dachas, which are summer cottages, often most of them are really teeny tiny cottages, became a reward for good behavior, a reward for good work. Allotments to these little gardens were distributed through people's workplaces. And it meant that they had this plot out of the city in the countryside where they could grow their own produce, they could have healthy food, they weren't dependent on whatever was being manufactured and sold in the stores. They could gather wild things like berries and mushrooms, herbs, grasses, things like that. And they could have a moment of privacy, personal space with their families and friends. So it's kind of an antidote to some of those problems of the collectivism, the communalism. This was a place where people could actually have some control over what they were eating and with whom. And so this is a picture from an early Dacha summer cottage collective. They were still organized in structural ways that were very socialist. They had collectives. People, when they had their cottages, were organized into work brigades to take care of the communities. There was a president. There were usually KGB informers in there, all sorts of things. So it wasn't completely free and private, but people felt like it was. But this is kind of an early one from the 1930s. And this is what one of these Dacha gardens looks like today. So you kind of get a sense. They're really important spaces. So the idea was that people could grow their own food, they would have this, but the state also saw this as a resource for the entire population. So during those moments of food shortages throughout the 20th century of the Soviet era, people had to depend on their gardens as supplemental food sources. And so the state recognized that that was an important thing, kind of expected people to support themselves from their own gardens. More than that, the state taxed people on what they grew in their gardens. So they were expected to contribute to the rest of the country from their gardens. And so technically, tax collectors would come around and see how many, potato bushes people had and take, some portion of the potatoes or some portion of the tomatoes, or if somebody had chickens or goats or whatever, they would take part of that. So this then didn't necessarily please most people, and so they found all sorts of creative ways to get around the system. So people were engaging the Soviet state by manipulating what they were growing, hiding their goats, moving their chickens to a neighbor's house, bringing them back, doing all sorts of creative things. But they were actively engaging the state, right? So they're engaging in a form of resistance to the state here too. And at the same time, with a sense of food as an entitlement and kind of the extension of public dining where people were expected to eat communally, there was also concern about what about the people who were at the bottom of the socioeconomic hierarchy. And here food was considered something that was a right of citizenship. And so people who were the most marginalized, poor people, single mothers with lots of children, invalids, veterans, people like that, were actually given supplemental food and often given access to special, what we would call soup kitchens, and kind of rewarded for their contributions to the state. And so it's both kind of a compensation for their disadvantages, but then for people who had done really important things to state projects, particularly veterans, disabled veterans, and mothers with lots of children because they were reproducing the nation, they were given extra food rations. And so there were kind of kitchens that were set up for people to go to these places. Now, because of the way this entitlement system was framed in the Soviet Union, this was not called welfare in the sense that we're familiar with it in North America. It was called social defense or social protection. The idea was that the entire country, the entire society would be supported and protected as long as these people are helped as well. And so this is a picture. Some of my research has been done in a series of soup kitchen programs in Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union. I'd be happy to talk about that later, but there's a little blue sign in the window over there on the left. And so this is a sign that actually indicates this is a cafeteria where people can go if they have access to, if they're certified and are eligible for these programs. And it actually says social support, social defense on that sign. Okay, so this then raises questions about what it means to consume food in Russia. It's really about a project of being a good citizen. It's about being a responsible person, and perhaps it's really a form of patriotism. This is a milk truck. It was very common during the Soviet era, and still happens today in more rural areas, where milk would be trucked in from the state farm, just in a truck like that, and people would show up with their bags and buckets and just fill fresh milk off the back, and then they'd go home and boil it, skim off the cream, and drink it. But this is considered a very appropriate, very Russian way of buying milk. And actually, just as kind of a side note, there's some really interesting research coming out about milk and raw milk in particular from Lithuania, a huge dairy producing country. And one of the things that happened when Lithuania joined the European Union was the European Union said you can't have raw milk anymore, it's not safe, it's not sterilized, it's not pasteurized, it's not controlled by our factories. And so lots of Lithuanian citizens who were used to this form created an underground economy of raw milk. And so what happened was there were all these elderly women, Lithuanian babushki, who were kind of the anarchist raw milk movement in Lithuania. So people take their food seriously, right? So kind of continuing this theme then of patriotism, political values, and food, we see this playing out in all sorts of ways in Russia. One of the things that is really interesting during the Soviet era and is now continuing in the post-Soviet era, and where we're starting to do a transition here, is that there were a lot of brands, food brands, that were explicitly patriotic, explicitly themed around Russian and Soviet values. And candy factories are probably the best example of this. This is the Red Oktyabr candy factory. It was the premier candy factory in the Soviet Union. So Red Oktyabr, right? A revolutionary reference. Yes?
This picture, if you look at the cars, appears to be newer. I mean, these cars are not the 20s and 30s.
No, this is, right. So,
This is more current.
right. So this factory, I think, was built in the late 1800s, but I took this picture in the early 1990s. So that's, yeah, so that's why you see this shift.
You're jumping.
Mm-hmm. Right, yes, thank you. So the images.
Before, the women in the milk truck was not the 20s and 30s.
Right. Yeah, so kind of the practices are continuing, but yeah, the images that I have now are more contemporary.
Are these practices, were they continued in Hungary?
Yes, in many cases, yes. So we kind of see consistencies across the former socialist landscape, absolutely. Okay, so kind of Red Oktyabr. So this is a caveat now, we're kind of getting into my own pictures here, but of things that have continued. So Red Oktyabr, the other major candy factories were Bolshevik and Red Front. And there were some others, but yeah, all these kind of explicit socialist themes. This is a brand, it's Champion brand of juice. And this was a Soviet era brand that was resuscitated in the early 1990s. So again, this is kind of an early 1990s picture here, but it's all kind of images of wrestlers and bodybuilders and Soviet athletes, right? Yeah, exactly, right? You build the Soviet nation, the Soviet body through these types of foods. Okay, so now, so some of these things are continuing, but why? What's going on? And here's where we're going to start making kind of the post-Soviet transition. That's where we're going to go now with the discussion. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, or dissolved, depending on how you want to think about it. And independent Russia was created in 1991. And with that came a complete radical reorganization of the political system and the economic system. And the economic system was probably the most important restructuring. It went from a communist state socialist system to a neoliberal capitalist market system. So, and this was part of a shock therapy approach where the idea was that people literally would go to bed one night in a communist system and wake up in a capitalist system the next day. And you can imagine how well this worked, right? But this was what the Washington reformers thought would be a good way to do things, just kind of a radical break. And we're seeing all kinds of repercussions of that playing out right now in Ukraine, kind of why these things don't actually work that way. But one of the things that happened was that almost immediately the Soviet state, or the post-Soviet Russian state, withdrew from anything that could be considered an entitlement or welfare system. It just left that to the market, right? That's kind of this neoliberal model that you don't need to provide benefits to people. A market will create that form of social support. So the Russian state just withdrew, defunded all of these programs that provided people with supplemental food, housing, job security, any of those things. And the other thing was that Western companies rushed into Russia to set up shop and start providing, a more modern Western capitalist consumer economy. Most of this had to do with food because of this kind of history of shortages. And so a couple of things happened. One was that private charities had to step in to do the work of public dining. So public dining, this collective social support system of providing food to people, the idea of food as a right, suddenly now became something that charities had to deal with. And charities did the work. So this is actually a kitchen that, a cafeteria that had been part of one of the children's palaces in Moscow, where children were brought in and, during the Soviet era, and there were classes and libraries and sports facilities and free food, and they ate, it's this wonderful thing. And now suddenly charities are in there providing food for low-income people. It's a radical break. But then the other thing was this kind of push to a Western type of food culture. And I say Western because it really was kind of geared around particular Western symbols like McDonald's and Pizza Hut and Nestle and Kraft. This is the first McDonald's that went into into Russia, but it actually went into the Soviet Union in 1990, shortly before the collapse of the Soviet Union. And it's in a central area, downtown Moscow. And it took McDonald's 14 years to get into Russia, or into the Soviet Union at that point. Lots of negotiation. Soviet Union did not want it because it was a symbol of the West. And in fact, once McDonald's went in, it was the Canadian franchise. It was not the American franchise. Specifically because of Cold War politics, the political symbolism of what McDonald's was. It was safe for Canadian McDonald's to go in. McDonald's was the first Western company to go in and really be successful. And part of that had to do with the fact that the president of McDonald's Canada, George Cohan, was very careful to present McDonald's as a Russian company, not as a foreign Western company. And so you kind of see some of that coming back in just a minute. But so this is the first McDonald's. There's now something like 150 or 200 McDonald's across Russia. And you can kind of see the inroads that McDonald's has made. This was this is a historic estate in Moscow. There was, this was actually, ironically, the American Chamber of Commerce 4th of July party. But people are walking through these 18th century estates and then going to the Ronald McDonald bouncy house. So McDonald's is there, and it brought in with it all sorts of other Western food cultures. So what happened? Did people embrace it? Did they like it? Did they reject it? Yes and no. Some really interesting things happened. McDonald's went in 1990. Pizza Hut came in about the same time. All these other Western supermarkets, everything came in. By the late 1990s, there was a nationalist backlash in Russia to this. Russian consumers were tired of Western products, tired of this message that Russia was inferior to Western consumer goods. And this played out not just in consumer goods, but it played out in national politics. So this is 1998. There was a federal election. This is the Fatherland political party. And fatherland here, the word means both fatherland and domestic production. It's a word that means both things, right? And so the kind of slogan is, by buying domestic or fatherland products, you're helping yourself. And all of the images for all of the campaign posters had to do with food production, kind of a return to Russian domestic food production. This then got picked up with a larger nationalist marketing campaign about, the slogan here is support Russian production, Russian manufacturing. And so it's the creation of this circle seal down here, the Made in Russia seal. So that campaign was 1998. This was kind of early 1999. This was already appearing. And so this is on a billboard or a bus stop, but these posters were everywhere. It was about mapping the Russian territory with domestic production, kind of a patriotic push to say, look, we can produce all of these wonderful things. Look what it is. And many of those are actually food products as well. And then we start seeing a very explicit advertising campaign where products are using patriotic themes, particularly Soviet-era patriotic themes. This is for a brand of vodka, Istok or Truth vodka. The slogan is, when I return. And so it's kind of a return in a way to kind of a Soviet era, and all of the figures in these advertisements were Soviet-era heroes, military heroes, aviation heroes, cosmonauts. So you see another kind of World War II aviation hero. And then it starts going a bit deeper in history with the nationalist themes, and we start getting 18th and 19th century figures coming in with this advertising. And so this is an advertisement for beer with a kind of a historic theme. And this is just one. There's lots and lots of historically themed beers. But the other thing that is really important about this is suddenly we get the use of the words we and ours. So Nash means ours, and we, which is down here, kind of the big word on the billboard, means we. And this is a very explicitly Russian invocation of national identity, of insiderness. When people talk about who are the people who belong to us, to ours, they mean people they share something in common with. It can be flexible, it can incorporate foreigners, it can be really inclusive and exclude other Russians, but really it's a sign of Russianness. We see this same invocation actually happening in other post-Soviet countries as well, using the same terminology, but to mean Bulgarian or Ukrainian or whatever it is. And so here, this brand of beer is saying, we are preserving the taste of beer for you, kind of the authentic taste of the nation for you. This Nasha or ours or we starts to become used as the actual brand name for things. There's a whole brand of Nash products at one point. And that was what people would look for when they would go shopping. They would ask somebody at the store, is this our product or is it their product, meaning a foreign product? And so people would make distinctions about that, and then labels would actually say our product on it. This is a pizza restaurant, Nasha Pizza, our pizzas. Another place, kind of central Moscow, but in the district where the Victory Park, so very close to where the metros collided last week. This is an old historic district of Moscow. It's also the road out to the Borodino field, so kind of 1812, Napoleon, the battle with Napoleon. So it has all of these resonances in this neighborhood of kind of Russia's deep history. So this is our pizza. When Russia had an economic collapse in 1998, and many Western corporations fled because they couldn't survive this economic collapse. Pizza Hut was one of the restaurants that just shut its doors and left. This was the Pizza Hut restaurant. It is now our pizza. So what does it mean to have something that's ours or we? There is a particular set of values that people are expecting when they use the codes ours or we. And these are deeper cultural values and qualities that they're expecting. So if you ask people, what does it mean that something's ours? These are the sorts of things that they'll tell you. One is that you know where products are coming from. There's a kind of sense of a hand-to-hand, direct, from the producer to the consumer relationship. Farmers markets are kind of the best example of this in Russia, where even if a customer doesn't know the person selling the product, they'll create a personal relationship and then go back to that person over and over and over again, because that will convey a sense of trust and quality in that product. But it's really about giving things hand to hand. And there's certain things that are so precious about this hand to hand relationship that they can only be given over hand to hand, and other things are dangerous to that hand to hand relationship. People don't pass money from hand to hand. It goes on a counter, and then you pick up the money. And that's because money will violate these relationships of trust and intimacy. Nasha, our products also convey a sense that they're homemade or handmade, that there's that investment of the person behind the scenes in them. This is a very informal farmer's market in a small village several hours outside of Moscow. And I took this, I don't know, kind of late 1990s, early 2000s, but very typical. And so these are just women, primarily a few men, but mostly women who pick things from their own gardens, from their backyards, from the forest. There's mushrooms, there's garlic, there's pumpkins, there's fresh pickles, there's things like that. But it's really the sense that somebody has taken the time to do this. They're not mass produced. So these are some of the qualities behind that Nasha idea. They got pulled into national manufacturing, right? So this is a brand of Russian milk. It was the leading Russian dairy manufacturer. And it's a way to kind of signal that they were Russian. They had these national values. They drew on all of these themes of Nasha, of having, you can see it with the imagery here, of the grandmother from the village. Okay, you know who this person is. The brand is actually called Little House in the Village. So it kind of conveys that traditional quality. Here's rustic Russian heritage, kind of the family, all of these values. And then we start seeing that in other ways too, kind of this emphasis on the homemade, handmade, rusticity quality. This is for a brand of beer. And so the basket is the basket that people would use when they go to their cottages and go pick strawberries in the woods. But it's got bottle caps in it instead, right? But it's this allusion to Russian provincial life. And it also says, kind of the tagline is, a summer without Old Miller beer is just a soulless accumulation of vitamins. So it's kind of playing on ideas of soulfulness. And so it actually says this is a soulful beer, right? So it's catching other ideas about what makes Russians distinct, and it's that they have soul, they have a depth to them. Okay, so I said McDonald's presented itself as a Russian company. It did, and it's been very successful at this. So McDonald's has very carefully drawn on all of these values of what Russian consumers think is Russian, and used it to present itself as a company to support its customers. It's used Soviet-era practices of rewarding its customers, of giving them medals that look like Soviet-era hero medals, of participating in the community, of doing all sorts of things that really are more Soviet than capitalist. And then this is kind of the quintessential, let me back up. One other thing with this is that McDonald's has long encouraged its customers to come in and make McDonald's a space for public dining, for families, for workers to come together. The American fast food model is you come in, you sit your 20 minutes, then you have to leave, right? They deliberately make chairs that are too uncomfortable for you to sit in. There's a sign, there's a manager who sends you out. McDonald's doesn't care. They let people sit there. People have birthday parties. They bring in outside food and birthday cakes and bottles of champagne to McDonald's. Homeless kids come in and eat leftover food that people have left. And I've watched managers actually bring food to them. right? There's a different sense of community in the Russian version of McDonald's. They've really been careful about who they are, that they're part of the Russian community. This is a poster from the early 2000s for trying to encourage people to apply to come work at McDonald's. And it says, McDonald's, это наша компания, it's our company. And so they're explicitly drawing on that. And then присоединяйтесь, come unite, come be together, using a Soviet-era slogan for political community, political activism. And then kind of these 5 figures here with the golden arches, kind of like a hammer and sickle, really drawing on Soviet-era iconography. So Russia, there's something about, we can watch the transition of Russia really playing out through this food use and kind of the food values. And we see some really interesting things about the persistence of older values and qualities, the incorporation of new values, and consumers then are able to kind of make sense of all of these different things and kind of pull them together. And food really still is very much a part of how they're presenting themselves as part of a Russian state, Russian nation today. Whether they're presenting themselves as older Soviet-era people, kind of socialist values, or as new modern capitalist citizens, they can do this. Food is flexible enough. So I just want to give you a couple of last quick pictures so you can kind of see a couple of things inside of some homes. You get a sense of some real people. And these are friends. I was visiting them at their cottage. Little teeny tiny kitchen. This was a teeny tiny table, as you can tell. It's not even as big as each of these tables. And we had 12 people crammed around that table. And that's something that's very typical of Russia, where people have these tiny apartments, tiny kitchens, and they are with each other, right? There's a sense of belonging, a sense of being with each other, being present with one another. And that is really at the heart of what it means to be Russian, to be invited to somebody's table, to be there. When people have formal dining rooms, that's for guests. You know you are part of Nasha when you're at a little table like this. And then I'm just going to end with this because I think it's a really lovely, lovely picture of my host at this cottage. He's the man on the right and his best friend from next door. And just kind of, this I think kind of epitomizes all of those other values in a nutshell. It's just kind of 2 people being with each other. Food is kind of the glue that brings them together, but it's also part of their performance of who they are and what their relationship is and what their relationship to being Russian is. So I'll stop there. Like I said, I can talk forever. So anyway, thanks. Do you guys have questions?
Were you involved in that recent Kitchen Sisters thing about, okay.
Yeah.
Because if I'm recalling it correctly, it was sort of saying that people have a sense of nostalgia for those apartment buildings that didn't have individual kitchens. Could you talk about that a little?
Yes, there's Russians have this really wonderful love-hate relationship with a lot of things, right? Yeah. There's, and nostalgia in Russian, actually many of the post-Soviet countries too, nostalgia is often for the awful things of the past, right? It's like the stuff that made people stronger and there was a real sense of community and vibrancy, yeah. So there is kind of that distancing, people don't want to go back to the time when they didn't have kitchens, but yet it was something kind of sweet and there was something kind of special. Yeah, it's the same way when people talk about their summer cottages. Oh my God, I hate it. It's so back-breaking. I don't ever want to go to mosquitoes or miserable. I can't wait to go back. Right, so it's that same sort of thing. Yeah.
I was wondering when you were talking about the communal kitchens, about whether there's a difference between making the same recipe badly and making something where the taste palette is supposed to be different. And so one of the things I think is kind of interesting is like, I feel like the taste palette of different foods is sometimes, in countries, is sometimes analogous, like the super embroidered kind of spice palette of Indian food and like Mughal painting kind of seems similar to me, like the aesthetic seems similar. And I just wondered, did they shift that in Russia? Did they actually change the taste palette or did they just make the same stuff badly?
That's a really good question. So let me, there's another piece to that. One of the things with the kind of Soviet emphasis on control and management and bureaucratic efficiency was that they created some department in one of the ministries that regulated all of the recipes for the entire Soviet Union. So any recipe that was going to be made in an institution, a restaurant, something like that, had to be approved at the center.
Kind of like school lunches in America.
Right. So it prevented individual chefs or cooks from deviating from that. So if they didn't have, so if you go, even today, it's still the case, and you go into a restaurant, the menu will actually tell you what the different ingredients are and the weights of those different ingredients and dishes. So it's not possible to have kind of a catch of the day or any kind of variation, right? It sometimes happens in people's homes, but Soviet citizens learned or were taught that they should follow the rules, including for cooking things. So some of that kind of diversity of the palate has been eliminated in Russia because people didn't have opportunities to experiment.
But so like with the meals in the, if I'm going to continue with that art analogy, so in the same way that the Soviet Union took all of the diverse visual arts before, and suddenly everything was Rodchenko and like that centralized poster agency, whatever, like did they do the same thing to the Russian palette? Did they take because of course it's so broad, there had to have been tons of regional cuisines, so they picked one and like that became the food of Russia?
Yes, so what they did was
All the way to the east?
all the way to the east. So there's been a long, several centuries process of this, of kind of incorporating those different cuisines, standardizing them, and then disseminating them again. And specifically during the Soviet era, with all the 15 different republics and all the different regions, there was an idea that everybody in the Soviet Union owned all of those, right? It was collective property. And so that was really part of this kind of standardizing, homogenizing it so that Latvians could recreate whatever Kazakhs were making, right? And so, yeah, much of that diversity was lost. And one of the things that's happening now is that some home cooks are trying to recreate that and go back. In some cases, there's no recipes. They're not sure what it was, and their grandmothers didn't even know what it was. And so, yeah. Does that answer?
Yeah, so because it's not like Chinese food all became Panda Kitchen. It's like it just got erased.
Right. And in fact, some of the chefs more recently have been complaining because the only two condiments that Russians use are salt and vinegar, and sometimes oil. And so they've been trying to teach people how to use other types of seasonings and other techniques, right? And it's been really difficult. Yeah.
To what extent is the term nach, is it nacha?
Nacha.
Is that a political term that refers to the state? And how much is it like an ethnic term that refers to the people, the nationality of?
Yes, it's both. So what does Nasha do? What does this term do, this ours term, right? Is it just about a political term? Is it an ethnic term? Is it a cultural term? And the answer is it does all of that. It's a flexible term of inclusivity that simply signals ours. And so it can be used as a political term, people who share a political philosophy or part of a political community. It can refer to an ethnicity. I've seen it used as part of kind of racist taunts against ethnic Russians who are black, that you're not ours. And so kind of it's a way of signaling whiteness. It can be about age. It can simply be about who is in one's kind of extended network of friends and colleagues. And in that case, it can be foreigners. It kind of signals in those senses who the people are you trust and would help with certain things. And so it's a really loose term. Yeah.
So when they decollectivized the farms, did they remain, are they like giant agribusinesses now, or have they become oligarchs, or have they been like more divided up, or, and how has that impacted on production? Is it better than it was?
So a couple of things happened with the chaos of the early years of the post-Soviet transition. There were no new laws about how private property was going to come into being and how people would buy things or sell things, and then there was no regulation anyway. And so what happened with decollectivization was it was, in many cases, people who happened to be there would grab land and write property documents, write deeds in their own names, right? In some cases with the state farms, there were legal, it's a legal system where people who had shares were then allocated shares of those farms, but often they were allocated shares that were not even touching one another. So then they would kind of sell them off or somebody would steal them. So it's a lot of, this is kind of the property market more generally in Russia, and agriculture is part of this. There's been a lot of kind of just people grabbing and trying to manipulate things. And so this then, so for some of the oligarchs or the other very wealthy people who were positioned strategically so they could kind of grab those things, they've grabbed them. In most cases, those have been turned into housing developments in prime places, especially around Moscow and Petersburg and big cities. In some cases, corporations have tried to buy up some of those farms, or some of the farms have become corporatized. I think Russia is probably getting more of its food from abroad right now than it certainly did in the past. I don't know what the breakdown is between domestic and foreign production. There is a push to revitalize the agricultural sector in Russia. There's a concern that Soviet-era agricultural practices were really bad for the environment, and so they're just not able to grow things the way they used to. But then other nationalist producers will say, but the soil is still so wonderful, you know, you're not. So there's kind of this nationalist thing about what the soil can do. But there are big farms that are now being built, and some of them that are trying to focus on alternative agriculture. So it's kind of, that's probably way too much, but yet not specific enough to answer your question. It's kind of there's a lot of stuff going on. It's very fluid, and much of it is kind of a battle now between corporate farms that are trying to really get a toehold in viable spaces, and developers who are also trying to grab those same places to build big McMansions.
To what extent do you think that public opinion surveys are reliable in Russia, and how well can they measure national sentiment?
When I was doing my fieldwork, I met a woman who worked at the Russian Statistical Office, and I said, oh, how can I get my hands on some of the statistical surveys for my research? She said, don't. I work in the statistics office and I don't trust the statistics. So I think I think that generally holds today. Statistics are doing very specific things in Russia, but I wouldn't trust them to save my life. Yeah.
I have a question about the kind of public discourse on nutrition. If Russian food is good for you because in an abstract sort of way because it's Russian, are they having any of the same kind of also nutrition arguments that we're having here about localized local food being, you know, a little more on the scientific side than on the, you know, I guess here it's sort of fairy tale side. Do they have a problem with obesity in kids and things that we're dealing with here?
So there are a couple of pieces to that. One is kind of ideas like, what do people think about local food and locally produced food? And that's still, I guess you could call it fairy tale stuff, but there's a lot of scientific expertise work coming out suggesting that locally grown foods are healthier, that they have fewer additives and preservatives, they have more vitamins because Russian soil has more vitamins, right? I mean, science can do all sorts of things that you want it to do. So that's kind of one set of conversations. And in fact, there have been embargoes against organic produce coming in from the EU because Russian authorities and Russian consumers are worried that European agriculture is not healthy, that the organic produce coming from Germany and the Netherlands is unhealthy, and only Russian produce is healthy. So it's kind of one set of conversations, right, which is really about the nation and who's, you know, what people are eating. Then there's another set of questions around health in terms of disease, childhood, intelligence, all of those sorts of themes. And there is quite a resistance to foreign products. The idea is that foreign products these aren't foods that are familiar to Russian consumers, even though we're now 25 years in, almost 30 years in, right? And so they're not as strange as they used to be. But that foreign products, especially Western products, have values in them, qualities in them of individualism and selfishness. And so children shouldn't eat Western foods because they'll grow up to be selfish, or they shouldn't, be just eating in restaurants all the time, Western restaurants, because they won't learn how to eat with one another. And so it comes back to some of these questions too about, a national body, right? I was part of a research team a couple of years ago for a large food corporation. International corporation, but they have a Russian company, and they just bought that dairy company that I showed you. And so they were the company was doing research to figure out what healthy food would be and what Russians would buy as healthy food. And over and over and over again, the Western researchers would ask, well, do you want it with, low sodium, low fat, whatever? And the mothers were like, I just want food that I can prepare at home because I don't want my kids eating out because I don't know what they're eating. And it was like the actual food didn't matter, it was the context for the food that mattered.
So I have two questions. Thank you, Brenda. It's very interesting. The first is, a lot of the marketing that you've seen, it seems like they're trying to reach back to a specific image from their idealized past. So are they reaching back to certain historical moments, or a moment? I only ask that because in almost all the food slides that I've seen, they have tomatoes. Tomatoes are a very recent addition to Russian cuisine because they're not indigenous. They're indigenous to the Americas. They would only arrive in the post-Columbian exchange, and my guess is that probably even later to Russia out of all the other places. So, are they consciously going for a certain period of time? I'm only thinking about this, again, the food, like the indigenization of clearly non-native foods. And so the corollary to that is is the marketing outside of Moscow similar to what you see in the capital? Going back to the question of like regional differences, if there are no regional differences, are they mainly just going on the Moscow model, or do they nuance it or change it in regional ways?
They're growing cabbages, yes, and potatoes and carrots, and So, yeah. I'll take the second part first, and that is this model of emphasizing the local is reproduced elsewhere, right? So it's not necessarily Moscow products, it's if somebody's in Vladivostok, it's whatever's local there, right? But still using that model of the local and ours and grandma made it and those sorts of things, right? And in fact, many foods, even today, if you go, especially cheese, certain types of produce, people know which regions are better for those things, and so the products themselves are marked geographically as opposed to varietally. So they know it's a Kazakh tomato and not a, whatever, red, I don't know what they're, that sort of thing, beefsteak tomato or something. So that's how people kind of, still think about those terms of kind of regional, local intimacy themes. Now, the other thing about kind of people reaching back to different historical moments, and they are. But it's interesting that Russia's history is really deep, and so for perhaps every philosophical, political persuasion, there's a different historical moment consumers are reaching back to. So at one moment it might be recent Soviet past, another moment it might be 1940s. For a while there was a huge push for World War II deprivation foods among a certain political constituency that really wanted to celebrate Soviet greatness. And so they were going back and eating nettle soup and nettle tea, right, to kind of remind themselves of what World War II was like. Or sometimes it might be Imperial Russia at different moments, right? And so people are kind of playing with those historical moments. And with that, by playing with the historical moments, they're kind of recasting some of those historical facts to fit the narratives, right? So I suspect most folks would not even think about tomatoes not being originally from Russia, but because it's become Russian, now it's Russian, right? So I think most people don't know that potatoes arrived only in the 1860s, right? And that people didn't eat potatoes at first because the serfs were afraid of the potatoes. They had evil eyes in them. And now potatoes are, kind of standard.
Potatoes didn't get there till 1960s?
1860s. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think, speaking of food, it's time for us,
Thanks so much.
Oh,
It was
thank
really
you all.
nice.